Okay, so the resolution, one more time, I will read it. Resolved, democratic socialists should shift their entire strategy to one of creating networks of democratically run businesses within capitalism as the only way to realize the ideals of socialism consistent with human liberty. Arguing for the affirmative, Gene Epstein. Let's start running the clock. Gene, go ahead.
Ben, in defending this resolution, I'll start with a passage from your new book. Quote, "Socialism is the movement for the working class majority to take charge. That's a vast undertaking. Winning socialism means convincing a huge mass of people and then going through an immensely complicated process full of pitfalls and problems in which that enormous group of people figures out together how it can all work." Unquote. Let me add a passage from Bhaskar Sankara's The Socialist Manifesto. "Our task is formidable. Democratic socialists must secure decisive majorities in legislatures while winning hegemony in the unions. Then our organizations must be willing to flex their social power in the form of mass mobilizations and political strikes to counter the structural power of capital and ensure that our leaders choose confrontation over accommodation with elites." Now, in one of your videos, Ben, in which you were actually responding to me, you said that working in a capitalist firm is to experience, quote, "a totalitarian level of control of your every action," unquote. Later in that talk, you referred to the, quote, "poverty wages people are paid in capitalist firms." So in your view, the working class majority gets poverty wages in return for suffering totalitarian treatment. No doubt you feel a sense of moral urgency in liberating them. The plan for liberation that I'm about to outline will be much easier to carry out than the vast political undertaking that you and Bhaskar envision. To clear up one misunderstanding, the democratically run businesses within capitalism that I propose would not mainly consist of startups. On the contrary, my targets of takeover would primarily be existing firms, a point that is not at all original with me. Let's review the enormous resources that you could organize. The bottom half of the population accounts for 1/3 of all consumer spending, the bottom 4/5 for nearly 2/3, and the top 1/5 for more than 1/3. If you can get just 1/5 of consumers to support your plan, they should account for 15% of all consumer spending, especially since you'll probably get plenty of support from the top 1/5. As part of the top 1/5, I give the project my support. Now notice the first advantage of my plan, winning over just 1/5 of the population. To bring about a socialist economy at the ballot box, you and Bhaskar would need more than half, or well more than half, to get your decisive majorities. I chose the figure of 15% of consumer spending for a special reason. The profit margin for non-financial corporations is just a little over 13%. In other words, 13% of their revenue goes to profits. So if our Socialist Consumer Union has a 15% share, it will command enough of a swing to make many such companies profitable or to deny them all their profits, and then some. On the investment side, labor union pension funds in the U.S. command over $1 trillion, and worldwide, union pension funds command an estimated $40 trillion. On top of that, there are sovereign wealth funds like the one belonging to Norway, valued at $1 trillion, which is invested in U.S. companies already. Quite apart from the prestige value of supporting a worthy ideal, all these sources of funding should perceive the likelihood of solid returns by purchasing controlling shares of companies that would be turned over to workers' control. Here is the case you can make to them about the 3 key competitive advantages of worker-controlled companies. First, as you have pointed out, they are more productive than their totalitarian counterparts. Second, the worker-controlled firms will benefit from the huge cost savings of no longer having to pay the executives and managers in charge those inflated salaries. Third, they'll have the powerful support I've already mentioned from the Consumer Coalition that would account for 15% of all consumer spending. And of course, I'm assuming the first targets would be companies that specialize in consumer products and services. The advantage on the other side that you cite is based on your idea that the totalitarian firms can pay poverty wages. But in fact, the average private sector compensation, consisting of wages and salaries plus benefits, is a little over $70,000 per employee. Of course, a lot of that average is soaked up by the inflated pay of the executive class, but that's the labor cost these firms face. So your idea that they can compete by paying poverty wages is simply mistaken. With the overwhelming advantages I've just listed, and with none on the other side, odds are great that the worker-owned companies will flourish. Takeovers of companies might include the strategy of the Socialist Consumer Union withdrawing its business through boycott from the target companies, thus making it possible to buy them on the cheap. Acquisition deals might involve the purchase of stock, with the voting rights going to the workers, or they can follow the pattern of employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, in which workers acquire the company on borrowed money and take advantage of the tax breaks from the ESOPs. Once these worker-run companies get off the ground, the movement will grow from there, from consumers, workers, and backers, as others are attracted by the force of their example. And as workers voluntarily abandon the totalitarian firms, those firms will have greater difficulty hiring productive labor and greater difficulty attracting consumers and backers. The worker-controlled economy under capitalism would eventually dominate. You've expressed support for the idea, associated with British politician Jeremy Corbyn, that workers be given right of first refusal to acquire firms that capitalists are relinquishing. But if the firms are being dumped because they aren't doing well, it's hardly a favor to encourage workers to buy up such lemons. And in general, it's clearly undesirable to wait for firms to be relinquished on a catch-as-catch-can basis. I'm sure you see that my proactive plan is the best way to go by far. Here's another advantage of my plan. Basker anticipates enormous pushback from, quote, the power of capital. Any attempt to take over the means of production through the iron fist of government would certainly get pushback from me and from many others far more powerful than I. But if you bring about worker control through capitalism, the reaction will be quite different. The Wall Street Journal editorial pages endorsed worker ownership. A while back, the pro-capitalist National Review, then edited by infamous right-winger William F. Buckley with a direct line to the Reaganites, ran an article celebrating the potential of worker ownership through capitalism. The article even went so far as to endorse the tax preferences given to employee stock ownership plans on the supply side grounds, that any tax cut is good. I remember that article quite well because I wrote it. I should stress that I was never a fan of National Review. I was a democratic socialist from about age 12 to age 26, and I remain a supporter of worker control, although clearly not for the same reasons as you. This brings me to the final advantage of my plan. It's the only way to achieve a socialism that is consistent with key aspects of human liberty that I'm sure you support. Since you told me you liked the first chapter of the Socialist Manifesto, in which Basker describes the socialism he wants, I'll quote a key passage. He writes that under socialism, banks are nationalized and the state takes over all private firms. He adds that each firm must pay a tax that must go into a, quote, public fund which invests in new endeavors. In other words, all funding of investment for both new endeavors and financing for expansion of existing endeavors will come under the control of democratically elected governments and planners. This brings us to a misunderstanding between you and me about Bilbo's Pizza in a Pan, the eating of which gave you a religious experience. You seem to think I believe you should disapprove of the people who own Bilbo's, but I was trying to make a different point. What I meant is that I thought you might disapprove of Bilbo's as an institution because it's a capitalist firm, and capitalist firms run totalitarian environments that pay workers poverty wages. But you were apparently willing to overlook all that and enjoy the pizza as a religious experience, and I commend you for that. So now imagine Bilbo seeks funds to expand into 200 cities. It's quite possible that the Democratic Socialists will give Bilbo's the funds, but there is no guarantee. If not, and if Bilbo's gets turned down by all the political agencies that control the funds, would you allow Bilbos to get private sector funding so that many millions of more people can partake of that religious experience? Under the socialism you endorse, you'll need to shut down the nearly $50 billion in financing raised every year through crowdfunding, which helps launch Bilbo pizza wannabes. And ironically, Bhaskar is using Kickstarter to finance his movie about socialism, and you're raising money with GoFundMe. And under yours and his socialism, those sources won't be available. You'll also need to outlaw the many other private ways people raise hundreds of billions of dollars in funding to finance their ventures, and be prepared to punish or imprison those who defy the socialist prohibition against private funding. To speak of a more literal religious experience, Connor Friedersdorf asked in The Atlantic about democratic socialism, quote, how many Muslim prayer rugs would the Democratic majority of workers vote to produce? How many Qurans? What share of construction materials would a majority of workers apportion to new mosques? Bhaskar has written, and I assume you agree, that he wants socialism to, quote, involve a commitment to a free civil society, especially for oppositional voices. But now imagine an oppositional voice like mine that wants the democratically elected planners to commit resources to put on public debates, catering to libertarians who support capitalism for my sole forum, or an oppositional voice like Dave's that wants to promote a podcast that pushes libertarian capitalist ideas, or an oppositional voice that needs resources to publicize the idea that the planners themselves are corrupt. Will they really back those who seek to criticize them? The litmus test of people who believe in such freedom is that they are willing to tolerate the propagation of ideas and practices they dislike. The intolerant have no problem welcoming ideas and practices they do like. I'm sure you've noticed the intolerant strain in all societies, including this one, and yet you want us all to take our chances with the potentially intolerant tyranny of the majority. To choose another religious experience, and to paraphrase Friedersdorf, would you prefer a social society in which kosher food and Orthodox synagogues are available if and only if a majority of workers exercising their democratic control assents? Or would you prefer a society in which private businesses can produce kosher food and build Orthodox synagogues in part because individuals possess economic rights as producers and consumers? The preferences of a majority of people around them be damned? The right to private ownership of the means of production is essential to freedom, but that freedom can, of course, be curbed if government threatens to throw you in prison for writing or saying the wrong thing. But without the right to private ownership, this kind of freedom doesn't stand a chance to begin with. The throttling of freedom under your socialism would probably be worse than I've described. That's because most of us will not have enough hours in the day or even any great desire to closely monitor the detailed decisions of the democratically elected planning boards. Here's why the planners will have a perfect excuse for rejecting projects they don't like: the economic reality of scarcity. By scarcity, I mean the fact that what everybody wants always adds up to more than there is. They can therefore reject projects they don't like on the factual grounds that the resources are simply not available. Bhaskar has written, and I'm sure you agree, workers at all levels know how to make things society needs and can run their workplaces collectively, cutting out the middlemen who own private property. So, Ben, let's talk about how workers can cut out those middlemen and build socialism in the here and now by owning that private property under the system of capitalism. I like the point you made in your book that the best you can hope for in any debate is that the other side will say, that's an interesting point. I'll have to think about it. Ben, I hope I've given you some points to think about.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gene. Very good. And you came in a minute under the time as somebody who runs a debate series quite often. And you even got a shot at Bill Buckley in there, which I think we can all agree that guy Bill Buckley really sucked. All right.
The moderator should not editorialize, but okay.
Well, listen, this is my first time, and it's my podcast, and any opportunity to take a shot at Bill Buckley, I feel it's outside the purview of the debate, so I feel comfortable there. All right. 15 minutes now for the negative. Ben Burgis, take it away.
All right. So before getting into why I'm taking the negative on this, I think that it's probably worth clarifying a couple of things and also thanking Gene, because I think he's probably done more to promote the national reputation of the best pizza place in Kalamazoo, Michigan, than any other, certain God knows any other New Yorker. So I don't remember what blog post or Facebook post he's finding from 20 years ago where I said this, but it's very good pizza. I might have overstated the case, but it's very good. Strongly endorse it. And I've thought many times as I listened to the podcast that you guys did about me, and as I prepared that video, how lucky you are that you were born into a capitalist society. Not because capitalism is particularly great. If I thought that, this would be a very boring debate. But because the version of Gene Epstein who was born into a socialist society, like the one that Bhaskar describes in the first chapter of the Socialist Manifesto, would have a serious problem. Because all of the restaurants that he could go to, all of the used bookstores he could shop at, etc., would embody a structure that he would have a problem with. Now, he wouldn't have a problem with it because the workers were running it. I understand that, right? That's the core of your point here. But he would have a problem with it because it was based on being propped up by these nationalized banks, by what he would regard as theft. And so he would think this is an unjust social structure, which would mean apparently that if he liked any pizza places, if he enjoyed browsing the books at any used bookstore, that he would be a terrible hypocrite. And I'm glad that Gene has saved that particular moral dilemma. All right. So we're talking about socialism, democratic socialism, the goals of democratic socialism, and whether those can best be achieved by the strategy that Gene has outlined. And so we should clarify what democratic socialism is and what the goals of democratic socialism are, right? So capitalism is, as I understand it, a system in which the capitalist class rules. I know that's not how Gene defined it in his debate with Bhaskar Sankara. He prefers a legalistic definition that capitalism is a society in which one has a right to be a capitalist. I find that unhelpful. I think that it's better to stay focused on actual material reality and think about what the actual structures of power are in any given society. A socialist society is one where the capitalist class no longer rules, where the division between the people who own and the people who work has been removed. And this is something that democratic socialists want for a variety of reasons, that it would be desirable in itself for workers to have the kind of dignity and autonomy that you get from not being in a situation where you have no realistic choice except for to go to work for somebody who'd be in that hierarchical relationship of you, as most people do not. There are only so many lifeboats out of the working class, and most of them sink. Most small businesses fail within the first year, or certainly the first 5 years. And so I'm happy to hear Gene say that he's not, after all, mostly talking about startups. But we want a society where people aren't worried about, for example, not having health care if they lose their current job, not being able to pay for their kids' college tuition if they lose their current job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the reasons, and this gets down to, I think, the core of the disagreement, is that in our view, any version of the concept of freedom worth its salt, right? That's the proposition, that this is the only way to achieve socialism that's consistent with human liberty. Well, we think that any worthwhile conception of human liberty, one, is not just binary. It's not you're either free or unfree. It's more complicated than that. It's going to come in degrees, that you can have degrees of coercion and degrees of liberty, and that workers are certainly much freer than serfs or slaves in previous forms of social organization, but they're not nearly free enough. And I think a lot of socialists would worry that even if you did have workers' control, well, that's certainly a big improvement. Everybody has some say at work. But if But if people are worried that they'll lose the things that I just mentioned, if they even lose their job, democratically, right? From, they lose their job at the co-op, then this is even too much domination, even by a group of workers of which you yourself are part. All right. So why do I take the negative here? Well, it's certainly not because I think that it's a bad idea to start networks of cooperative businesses within capitalism. Such networks where they exist, like the most successful example in the world, to the best of my knowledge, is the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. It's a federation of workers' cooperatives that's, a major employer. And if you've ever heard somebody like me go on about workers' cooperatives, you've heard all about Mondragon, so I'm not going to sing its praises here. But they do a lot of good. They lead to much better outcomes for people in the Basque region than you had before that in that example, than in other parts of Spain. They're also valuable as proof of concept. So Karl Marx, in his inaugural address to the First International, describing the sort of first workers' cooperatives that existed at that time, said these great social experiments had value that could not be overrated because they were proof of concept that you could have modern industrial production without a division between what he calls a class of masters and a class of hands. So this is also why, for example, the German Social Democratic Party, the party of Engels, of Rosa Luxemburg, of Karl Kautsky, the party that even Lenin said in 1919 was probably the best model of a mass workers' party that's ever existed, did, among the other things, take Gene's advice. Or it almost did. It took the first part of Gene's advice, said democratic socialists should indeed organize networks of cooperatives. But the question is whether they should do this exclusively, because this is the only way to achieve democratic socialist goals that's consistent with human liberty. And where my strong disagreement comes in is with the exclusively. So why don't I think that this should be the exclusive strategy? There are a few reasons. One of them has to do with whatever part of this is startups. Now, you said that you were not primarily thinking about startups. You were primarily thinking, which is usually what people are thinking of when they talk about promoting workers' cooperatives within capitalism. But you're primarily talking about targeting existing firms for boycotts and takeovers. But to the extent that this is still going to be a very unstable process, that's not a criticism in itself. I think that any strategy for achieving this is going to involve, some stability at some point, right? You can't change the form of social organization and have it be entirely smooth sailing. But to the extent this is going to be a very unstable process, you're still going to have a lot of risk involved. That you have this that you really weakened this company during the process of organizing the boycott and whatever strategies you're using to engineer these hostile takeovers. And so the question of, hey, whether people are going to go to work for the reorganized company, much less for a cooperative startup, if somebody gives you a risky business venture like that, do you want to go in as one of the shareholder members of this cooperative, whether it started from scratch or it started from this company that went to the brink of going out of business because of a boycott and is being reopened, which, by the way, is going to, fortunately, there is some evidence that companies that were going bankrupt that have been reorganized as cooperatives often have been successfully reorganized that way. But of course, that cuts both ways as far as the Corbyn proposal and your proposal. But a fair concern that people are going to have is, okay, so I'm going to start this reorganized business. We don't know how things are going to go. Do you want to go in on this? Well, if I do, am I going to lose my health care? If the reorganization is not successful, then I have to scramble again for a job at a hierarchical firm, like maybe the one I just left, to go work here. And is it going to be the case that by the time I do my job search, I find a new job, I get my new employer health insurance kicks in. I have to find a doctor who's in plan now, who's not necessarily the one I was seeing before. That, it starts to sound like you're gonna miss some prescription refills, and that's a pretty serious incentive not to do so. So I think that people would be a lot more willing to go in on this if we started doing statist, redistributive things like Medicare for all. So that's one reason I don't think it's enough. Another reason that I don't think it's enough is that you haven't really given us good reasons to say, hey, this should be part of the strategy. What I'm not hearing is a good reason to say this should be the only part of the strategy. In other words, that while we're organizing cooperative businesses, we shouldn't also, for example, elect Jeremy Corbyn so he can implement that John McDowell plan to give workers at businesses that are about to go under, outsource to other countries, or change ownership, the right of first refusal with government loans. Much less the Bhaskar Sankara proposal that we have public banking that could give nationalized banks that are, by the way, hardly examples of clean capitalism to start with, as far as what has a right to exist morally, even by your standards, and these nationalized banks, as a matter of public policy, could give out starter business loans to cooperatives rather than traditional hierarchical firms. Well, that would help a lot, right? So even aside from my skepticism about the effectiveness, for example, of boycotts versus these other strategies, and it seems to me that boycotts historically are a largely pretty unsuccessful tactic. The most famous examples where they have been successful, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott, you'll notice that was a geographically limited, pretty homogenous area. And it was also, people could see each other, so you could have this element of communal shaming violating the boycott. And I think people often really overestimate the value of that tactic. But hey, even if it was going to be really effective, you know what would be even more effective? Boycotts, takeover schemes, combined with the Corbyn plan, combined with nationalized banks that could give out these loans. That would be even better. And so I think that the core of the question dividing us is, well, should we do only part of that strategy, or should we use all tools at our disposal on the grounds, or should we do part of the strategy on the grounds that those other tools are illegitimate because they're coercive, because they're statist? And frankly, that gets back to the debate I had with our moderator back before he revealed himself as a comrade. So I don't want to say more about that here because I'm running up against the time. I've got about 2 minutes left, but I hope that comes up again in the question portion. But right now, I will really briefly say, as to the concerns, the Connor Friersdorf, I never know how to pronounce that guy's name. Okay, Connor F's concerns about religious liberty and related matters under socialism. You gave the example of deep dish pizza, weightier examples that you discussed in your debate with Bhaskar. I love deep dish pizza, but this stuff is more important. Would include things like vegan, that like people who don't want to eat meat, that's more popular than it used to be, but it's still a relatively unpopular view. Minority religions that have special needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to say two things real quick about this. And if I go like 30 seconds over, I'm going to try not to do more than that. So one, I think that this is a a priori concern that really ignores how public institutions tend to work in the real world. If we lived in a society where there were no laws about what buildings you could put here, you could raise structurally identical worries about democratically empowering cities to pass zoning laws and institute zoning boards. And fair enough, sometimes cities do try to use those things to stop the construction of mosques, etc. However, overall, we live in a society with both democratic zoning and lots of mosques, lots of vegan restaurants, etc. Also, it's worth noting that in the society that we actually live in the real world, the only thing that brought down the whites-only signs from privately owned restaurants around, vast swathes of this country was a heavy dose of statist coercion via the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think that the track record of democratic statism is pretty good here, and I'd need a much better reason to think that public institutions in a hypothetical future, socialist future, would have this problem that seems to be notably absent from the public institutions of the present.
All right. Very good. Thank you, gentlemen, both.